The portrait of Queen Victoria in London's National Portrait Gallery is a propaganda masterpiece. It depicts a woman of immense dignity and moral fortitude, adorned in regal silks and holding a scepter, symbolizing a benevolent empire and a civilization believed to be spreading enlightenment globally. While this image commands respect, a look at her government's actual financial ledgers from 1839 reveals a far uglier, more truthful picture. Instead of records of a civilized monarchy, you would find the accounting books of a criminal enterprise. Beneath its facade of Victorian morality, the mid-19th century British Empire was running the largest and most sophisticated drug trafficking operation in human history. The sight of British warships devastating the Chinese coast to safeguard drug smugglers has been meticulously erased from Western consciousness. It's absent from elite school curricula and nostalgic royal family dramas. This memory is inconvenient. For the British, it appears as a shameful error in judgment. For the Chinese, it represents the brutal violation of a civilization. Yet, for the men in the East India Company boardrooms, the decision to transform the empire into a cartel was not driven by malice but by a dire need for survival. The British Empire's machinery ran on money, but by the 1830s, its engine was sputtering. To comprehend the moral decay of the British state, one must grasp the alarming economics of tea. By the 19th century, the British public had developed an almost pathological addiction to it. Tea was more than just a beverage. It fueled the Industrial Revolution, making grueling 14-hour shifts in Manchester's dark, satanic mills bearable, and serving as the social glue for the aristocracy. The British government relied on tea import taxes to build its battleships and compensate its civil servants. However, this economic model harbored a catastrophic flaw. The tea plant exclusively grew in China, and the Qing emperor, seated on the dragon throne in Beijing, had absolutely no interest in British Isles products. He didn't want their wool as his people wore silk. He didn't desire their mechanical clocks, given that Chinese astronomers had mapped the stars centuries before the British learned to read. The emperor made it clear to desperate British merchants that he would accept only one form of payment for his precious leaves: silver. For decades, the British Empire was literally bleeding its wealth into the Orient. Ships laden with millions of ounces of silver bullion sailed from London to Canton, returning with nothing but crates of dried vegetation destined for boiling and consumption. This trade imbalance was a hemorrhage that threatened to bankrupt the Bank of England. Reserves dwindled, and the currency destabilized. The East India Company directors, reviewing their balance sheets, realized that without a way to reclaim that silver, the empire would collapse under its own debt. They needed an irresistible product for the Chinese, a commodity that bypassed market logic and instead exploited the darker impulses of human biology. They found opium. The production of this poison was not left to the chaotic hands of private criminals. It was organized with the cold, bureaucratic efficiency of a government department. In the fertile plains of the Bengal Presidency, the British colonial administration established a monopoly that would make a modern drug lord weep with envy. They compelled tens of thousands of Indian farmers to plow over their food crops and plant vast fields of poppies. Descriptions of the processing factories at Patna and Ghazipur read like scenes from a dystopian novel. These were industrial cathedrals of narcotics. In the Great Hall of the Ghazipur factory, visitors described seeing thousands of earthenware jars stacked to the ceiling, each filled with thick black opium paste. They recalled the smell, a sickeningly sweet, heavy odor that permeated the entire district. They described armies of local workers who spent their days waist-deep in the drug, churning it in massive vats to ensure consistent potency. This was the genius of the British system, applying Industrial Revolution standards to the production of an illegal narcotic. They standardized the size of the opium balls and stamped each cake with the East India Company's official seal, just as they would a bar of gold or a crate of rifles. It was effectively a product of the state. However, the gentlemen in London faced a legal dilemma. Opium sales were strictly prohibited in China, with trafficking punishable by death by strangulation. The British government could not be seen to directly violate the laws of a sovereign nation. So, they devised a system of plausible deniability that was as cynical as it was effective. The East India Company did not sail the ships to China. Instead, they sold the drugs at public auctions in Kolkata to private traders, These men were the smugglers and runners, individuals like William Jardine, a Scottish physician-turned-merchant with a brilliant mind and a complete absence of a moral compass. Jardine and his partners bought the government opium, loaded it onto fast clipper ships heavily armed with cannons, and sailed them to the Pearl River Delta. There, they anchored off the coast of the remote island of Lintin, transforming their ships into floating warehouses. They bribed local officials and armed local gangs, creating a distribution network that moved the poison from the decks of British ships into the veins of the Chinese people. And the silver came flooding back. The plan worked perfectly. The silver Britain paid for tea was recaptured by opium smugglers and then deposited back into the British banking system. The trade deficit was rectified. The empire was saved. But the cost was the slow-motion assassination of Chinese society. By 1838, the British were smuggling 40,000 chests of opium a year into China, roughly 5 million pounds of pure narcotic paste. The impact was apocalyptic. Reports from contemporary Chinese officials describe entire villages where men had ceased to work, spending their days curled on wooden pallets inhaling the smoke. The army rotted from within as soldiers sold their muskets to buy the drug. The bureaucracy was paralyzed because magistrates were high. The silver, the lifeblood of the Chinese economy, vanished, causing inflation and poverty that triggered famines and unrest. Qing Emperor Daoguang watched as his empire began to crumble, not from an invasion of soldiers, but from an invasion of addiction. He realized he faced an existential threat. If the flow of opium wasn't stopped, China would cease to exist as a functional state. In a moment of desperate resolve, the emperor turned to one of the few incorruptible men in his court. He appointed Lin Zexu, a scholar and poet from Fujian province, as his imperial commissioner. Lin Zexu is a figure who deserves to be as famous as Nelson or Napoleon. He was known as Blue Sky Lin because his integrity was as clear as the heavens. He was given a sword by the emperor and a mandate to wipe the curse of opium from the face of the Middle Kingdom. Lin Zexu arrived in Canton in March 1839, not to negotiate but to destroy the cartel. He launched a crackdown breathtaking in its speed and severity. He arrested thousands of Chinese dealers and imprisoned them. He rounded up tens of thousands of addicts, forcing them into rehabilitation centers where they were given a stark choice: break the habit or die. But Lin knew that arresting the victims was not enough. He had to cut off the head of the snake. He had to go after the British. He issued an ultimatum to the foreign merchants residing in the wealthy enclave of the 13 factories. He demanded they surrender every ounce of opium in their possession and sign a bond promising never to smuggle the drug again. When the British merchants attempted to stall him, Lin Zexu showed them the formidable resolve of a sovereign power pushed too far. He deployed troops to surround the foreign quarter, built barricades across the streets, and cut off food and water supplies. He ordered his men to beat drums and gongs all night long, denying the merchants sleep. He transformed their luxurious trading post into a prison. Trapped inside, the British Superintendent of Trade, Captain Charles Elliot, realized he had lost. Fearing for his countrymen's lives, Elliot ordered the merchants to surrender their stock, promising them that the British government, the Queen herself, would reimburse them for their losses. This was a moment of triumph for Lin Zexu. He seized over 20,000 chests of British opium, a mountain of drugs with a street value of millions of dollars, enough poison to keep China's entire population intoxicated for months. Lin did not sell it, he did not repurpose it. He ordered 3 massive trenches to be dug on the beach at Human. He had the opium balls crushed and thrown into the trenches, then mixed in lime, salt, and water. The chemical reaction caused the mixture to boil and sizzle, turning the precious narcotic into a useless, toxic sludge. Then, at low tide, he opened the sluice gates and washed the poison into the sea. It took 23 days to destroy it all. While workers stirred the boiling pits, Lin Zexu sat in his tent and composed a letter to Queen Victoria, a document that serves as the moral tombstone of the 19th century. He wrote to her not as a barbarian to a civilized monarch, but as a man of conscience to a woman he hoped shared his values. He asked her a question that still echoes through history. I am told that in your own country, opium smoking is strictly forbidden. Under these circumstances, how can you bear to let it be rolled out to poison other lands? He appealed to her humanity, assuming she simply didn't know what her subjects were doing in her name. He assumed that if the Queen of England knew the truth, she would stop it. But the letter was never answered. We do not know if Queen Victoria ever saw it. It likely gathered dust in a pigeonhole in the Foreign Office. Yet, even if she had read it, it's unlikely it would have changed the course of history. Because in London, the destruction of the opium was not seen as a righteous act of law enforcement. It was perceived as an intolerable theft of British property. When the news reached the City of London, the drug dealers did not hide in shame. They went on the offensive. William Jardine, the arch-smuggler, traveled to London and launched a lobbying campaign that would make modern corporate lobbyists look like amateurs. He met with Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston, unfolding maps of the Chinese coast and pointing to deep-water harbors and defenseless cities. He argued that the Chinese had insulted the British flag and that the opium's destruction was a violation of the sacred principles of free trade. He informed the government that the Chinese military was weak, armed with bows, arrows, and antiquated matchlocks. He promised that a small fleet of modern warships could bring the Celestial Empire to its knees in a matter of weeks. The British government was financially distressed. They needed the tea tax. They needed the silver. And now they faced a $20 million bill from their own merchants for the destroyed drugs. They had to make a choice. They could accept the loss and respect China's laws, or they could go to war to force the Chinese to pay for the poison they had destroyed. They chose war. The fleet that sailed from India to China in the summer of 1840 was more than just a military expedition. It was the physical manifestation of the Industrial Revolution, weaponized for organized crime. Leading this armada was a ship called the Nemesis, a terrifying glimpse into the future. The Nemesis was the first ocean-going iron warship in history. Powered by steam engines, it could sail against the wind and up shallow rivers inaccessible to the great wooden ships of the line. To the Chinese defenders who watched it approach the coast, it must have looked like a monster from a nightmare. Their own navy consisted of wooden junks powered by sail and oars, armed with cannons that had not changed significantly since the Ming Dynasty. The collision between these two forces was not a battle. It was an execution. The British strategy was simple and ruthless. They did not attempt to conquer China's vast interior. They simply strangled it. They sailed up the coast, bombarding forts and occupying key ports. They seized the tax barges carrying grain tribute to Beijing, threatening the capital with starvation. Chinese generals were brave men who had spent their lives studying the art of war, but they were fighting an enemy they could not comprehend. Their cannonballs bounced harmlessly off the Nemesis's iron hull. Their wooden fleets were set ablaze by Congreve rockets that screamed through the sky like dragons. Accounts from British officers describe watching the slaughter with a mixture of awe and pity, detailing Chinese soldiers standing their ground amidst a hail of grapeshot, firing their matchlocks until they were cut down where they stood. It was a clash between the medieval world and the modern world, and the modern world showed no mercy. As British forces moved north, leaving a trail of burning cities and shattered bodies, the emperor in Beijing was paralyzed by shock. He could not understand how a handful of barbarians from a small island on the other side of the world could dismantle the defenses of the Middle Kingdom with such ease. But the British were not interested in the emperor's confusion. They were interested in his submission. By the summer of 1842, the British fleet had sailed up the Yangtze River and trained their guns on the ancient city of Nanjing. They threatened to burn the city to the ground if the emperor did not surrender. Faced with the annihilation of his people, the emperor capitulated. On August 29, 1842, Chinese officials boarded the British flagship, the HMS Cornwallis. There, under the shadow of British guns, they signed the Treaty of Nanking. The Treaty of Nanking is known in China as the first of the unequal treaties. It is a document of profound humiliation. The terms were dictated by the victors and designed to strip China of its economic sovereignty. The British demanded that China pay an indemnity of 21 million silver dollars. 6 million of those dollars were specifically earmarked to pay for the opium Lin Zexu had destroyed. It is a detail that still defies belief. The British government forced the Chinese government to pay for drugs that had been smuggled into their country against their laws. It was a gangster protection racket writ large on the stage of international diplomacy. But the money was only part of the price. The treaty forced China to open 5 treaty ports where British merchants could live and trade without being subject to Chinese laws. And most fatefully, it forced the emperor to cede a rocky island off the southern coast to the British crown in perpetuity. That island was Hong Kong. The British Foreign Secretary, Lord Palmerston, was initially furious about Hong Kong. He called it a barren rock with nary a house upon it. He had wanted a major productive territory, not a desolate island of fishermen and pirates. But the drug smugglers knew better. They knew that Hong Kong was the prize. It was the perfect safe haven. Under the protection of the Union Jack, opium traders could build their warehouses and dock their ships without fear of the Chinese police. Hong Kong became the operational headquarters of the cartel. It was the logistical hub from which the poison flowed into the continent. In the years following the treaty, the opium trade did not just resume. It exploded. The British administration in India ramped up production to meet the demand of a broken China. By the 1880s, the British were selling over 6,000 tons of opium to China every year. The revenue from this trade became the financial backbone of the British Raj in India. It paid for the railways. It paid for the civil service. It paid for the navy that patrolled the world's oceans. The Pax Britannica, the great era of British peace and prosperity, was underwritten by the addiction of millions of Chinese peasants. The psychological impact on China was even more devastating than the economic cost. The Opium War shattered the Chinese worldview. For thousands of years, they had viewed themselves as the center of the world, the apex of civilization. Now they had been brought low by a nation of drug pushers. This trauma birthed what is known today as the Century of Humiliation. It was a period of internal chaos, civil war, and foreign domination that would last until the mid-20th century. It is the scar that defines modern China. When the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party today speak of national rejuvenation or warn against foreign interference, they are not speaking in abstract political terms. They are remembering the smoking pits of Human and the burning of the Summer Palace. They are remembering the time when the West came knocking, not with an open hand, but with a closed fist full of poison. But what of the men who orchestrated this crime? What happened to William Jardine, the iron-headed old rat? Did he face justice for the misery he profited from? On the contrary, he returned to London a hero. He was elected to Parliament. His partner, James Matheson, became a baronet and one of the largest landowners in Britain. The company they founded, Jardine Matheson and Company, did not disappear into the shadows. It evolved. It moved from opium into shipping, into real estate, into finance. It became one of the Hongs, the great trading houses that built modern Hong Kong. If you walk through the financial district of Hong Kong today, you will see the legacy of the drug trade written in the skyline. You will see Jardine House with its distinctive round windows looking out over the harbor that was once filled with opium clippers. You will see streets named after the smugglers. The glittering prosperity of one of the world's great financial capitals is built on a foundation laid by the cartel. There's a strange and bitter irony in the legacy of the Opium Wars. The British Empire eventually turned against the trade. By the early 20th century, the moral crusade against opium, led by religious groups in England, finally gained enough political power to force the government to stop the exports. But they did not stop it because they suddenly found a conscience. They stopped it because it was no longer necessary. The empire had found other ways to make money, but the damage was done. While the concrete in a reactor core might sit as a monument to the betrayal of an ally, the skyline of Hong Kong stands as a monument to the betrayal of a civilization. The Opium War proves that the line between a legitimate government and a criminal enterprise is often just a matter of who has the bigger navy. It teaches us that free trade is a noble concept that can be twisted into a weapon of exploitation. In the end, the story of the Queen's Cartel is a warning. We like to think of history as a steady march towards progress, towards more rights and more morality. But the 19th century shows us that progress is often funded by the suffering of the invisible. Queen Victoria sat on her throne for 63 years, a symbol of virtue and grace. But the jewels in her crown were polished with silver drained from a dying empire, and the tea in her cup was steeped in the tragedy of a nation brought to its knees. The ghosts of the opium dens have not vanished. They linger in the suspicion that still divides the East from the West. They remind us that sovereignty is not a given right. It is a privilege that can be taken away by anyone with a gunboat and a product to sell. And once you force a nation to swallow your poison, you can never truly expect them to trust you when you offer them a cure. To remain informed and anticipatory, subscribe now, for when history is ultimately recorded, you'll desire to be counted among the insightful few who foresaw these developments. Thank you for viewing.